presentation, I'm going to talk to you a little bit about using the power of logic, or using a logical method to structure the engagement with your client and most effectively ascertain what the true problem is your client is facing and how you can work towards solution. But before we start that, there are two larger issues that I'd like to talk about. You've got two challenges and two particular things that you have to do to make your capstone project successful. First, you have to manage the task. You have to actually do the research, do the technical work, meet with a client, ascertain information, analyze data, and come up with a set of recommendations. That's a very, very important part of the project. Secondly, you have to manage a set of relationships, both between your team members and, very importantly, with your client. And you've got to pay attention to both of these tasks and spend almost equal amount of effort on each one, because I love the words of Steve Covey, who said, if you neglect either one of these tasks or either one of these challenges, you'll neglect both of them. So in order for you to be effective in the capstone project, you really have to work with your client, and you have to work to preserve that relationship, and you have to do the task work. So now with that in mind, let's move on and talk about using logic. So why use logic and a logical method as a way to structure your capstone project? Well, first, a logical method will help you understand and help you develop a full range of options for your client to think about as potential solutions to the issue that they've brought you. Secondly, using logic will help you manage the scope of the project, so you know what's a priority, what kinds of things have to be done, what kinds of things are luxuries, and what kinds of things don't need to be done at all. Third, a logical process will help you break apart the issue into its component parts so that you can look at each part, and then that same logical process will help you put things back into a collective whole. Finally, we actually think in logical ways. And so as you use this logical method, it will help you to develop a story or a compelling case that your client can both understand and buy into. So the logical process that we're going to talk about actually has three major components. There's a preparation phase, there is a research phase, and there is the communication phase where you actually present to your client. There are 9 subcomponents to this. I just want to introduce them here, and we're only going to talk about a few of them today. The first thing is you have to define the problem. Secondly, once you've defined the problem, you have to accurately frame it and understand its component pieces. Third, you have to develop a set of hypotheses or a theory of what you think potential solutions might be. Fourth, you're going to create a work plan that's going to allow you to execute on all the necessary tasks to do the project. 5, you're almost invariably going to collect some data. Part of the solution to the client's issue is that they don't have all the information that they need, and so you're going to have to collect some data. Then you're going to have to analyze that data. We're going to talk about 6 of these 7 processes today, and then later we'll talk about how to create an effective story, one that's compelling and interesting, how to target that story to the particular needs and demands of your client, and then how to engage and create a final deliverable that will be super high quality. So let's talk about how you define the problem. Well, as an aid to defining the problem, I gave you access to the problem statement worksheet, and I think you'll find this document to be very helpful as you define the problem and as you write the case study. So let me just say at the outset, as I mentioned in class, this is an iterative document. You should work through this several different times. It's not one where you fill it out once and you've got the answer. You're going to have to keep coming back, and as you answer one question, it will help give you insight to the others. So again, let's talk about the first things first in terms of setting up this client problem statement worksheet. The first 2 elements are the key questions. What's the central question? What does your client want to know? Then what's the deep question? In order to solve the problem that they have or face the issue that they're facing, there's usually a deeper question, something that they need to know. And it's important for you to remember at the outset that what the client wants to know and what they need to know are often separate things. They're generally related, but they aren't the same question. Giving the client what they want is critical to establish your credibility as a consulting team, that you actually care about them and care about solving their problem. However, it's usually in answering the deep question that you create real business value for your client when you tell them what they need to hear. Then the next thing you need to figure out is who are the decision makers? And the decision maker may not be your client. Your client might have to take your output and your deliverable back to other people, either vertically take it up the chain or laterally to another work group. And so it's important for you to understand, how does the work you're doing for your client relate to the decision that's going to be made about what you're telling them to do. And then the last thing that you want to know here in terms of first things is, how are they managing the problem? We talked a little bit about this. Are they managing through denial, that they don't see there's a problem at all? Do they manage by denial, thinking that they already know the solution, it's just a matter of implementation? Or is it a trial and error process where they really know there's a problem, but they don't have any idea what to do, so they're just they're throwing spaghetti against the wall and seeing what might stick? There are several ways. Or are they systematically dealing with the problem? Have they really brought you in because they know they need help? So understanding what drives your client, how they're managing the problem, will help you establish some ground rules for a successful project. The next set of things that you want to be aware of, the core logic of the issue itself. What's the situation? For example, the company might say, we have an outstanding brand in our marketplace, or the market in which we're competing is experiencing rapid technological change. Whatever the particular client need is, this is the state of the world. This is the current situation that they're facing. Then you need to understand the complication. So we have a great brand. Historically, our brand equity is really high. However, we're now reaching out to a new customer base, and we're not sure that our brand is reaching them. Or technology is changing rapidly, but maybe we don't have the right technological or strategic skills to understand that. The complication is why they need your help. What is it that you're going to help them do? It's overcome that complication. Once you've got the logic of the issue, there are a couple of other critical considerations. Who cares? So who are the stakeholders to this project? Is it customers, employees, top management, investors, regulators, the community at large? Who are the stakeholders and what are their stake? What this will do is add some nuance and complexity to the issue that you're dealing with, because it'll help frame some solutions might not actually work because they violate some stakeholder expectations. And then you need to understand, going through this process, what are the decision criteria that the organization is going to use to adopt or reject your proposal. So are there going to be financial and rational criteria about means, ends, pro, cons, net present value? Or is this an emotional decision where you're providing relief or an out from fear? Or is it a political decision where you're going to have to weigh the wants and interests of different factions within the organization? Just a heads up, it's probably going to be a combination of all four, and it's important for you because this will help you frame what's acceptable. What kinds of recommendations are likely to be accepted are ones that meet the decision criteria. Finally, the last items on the sheet will help you make the project viable and doable for you. What are the constraints? What are the resources that you need? What kind of support do you need? Are you going to need access to employees to do interviews, to suppliers, to customer lists? Are you going to need secondary data that the company might have purchased or surveys they've already done? What are the constraints on the resources that you're going to need? You want to identify these so that you make sure that you actually get what you need. Finally, what are the limitations? What's the scope of the project? Now, what's going to happen is you're going to agree on a preliminary scope with your client in the next couple of weeks as you write the case study and as you frame the issue. Your client will almost naturally want that scope to increase. part of your job managing that relationship is to avoid and to fight scope creep so that you don't commit, so that the client doesn't expect you to do and that you don't commit to doing more than you can. And this makes sure that your project's actually doable and that on the 11th of March you'll hand them a value-added deliverable. Let's talk a little bit now. We're not going to talk much about framing the problem because I think as you work through the problem statement worksheet, you'll naturally be able to write a case study that will help you frame the problem. So let's talk about developing hypotheses and creating a work plan. In terms of developing hypotheses, as you begin talking to your client, they'll have a number of important questions that they want you to answer. What you need to do is focus on the ones that are unresolved. And you want to state those clearly and in detail and perhaps break out subgroups. If, in fact, their question is all about X, maybe you have to understand Z in order to be able to understand X as well. Then you create an actual hypothesis, a declarative statement of what you think is going to happen. Our hypothesis is that if you will target the 18 to 24 demographic, you will find greater success. Whatever it is, you want to have a clearly declarative statement. And what you want to do is your client already has a number of hypotheses, things they think are going to work. Different members of your team will have different hypotheses. So iterate through all of those to come up with some clear hypotheses. Once you've got those, then you need to think about what are the models that you're going to use. Are you going to use the 7S model? I hope so. But you might also use Porter's 5 Forces or the company diamond or the resource-based model of the firm. Or what about some of the learning from your finance classes, from marketing? You want to talk about total available market, serviceable available market. But be clear about the models that are going to help you create and generate insight. Where are you going to get the data? Who's got it? When are you going to get it? What do you need to do to obtain that data? This is sort of a critical phase in the design stage of your research. Who will do what, when? If you don't answer these questions, all the work that you've done to this point will lag and will become stalled. We've all been in meetings where decisions were reached, but there was no decision maker who actually was given responsibility for implementation. Who, what, where, and when are critical questions. And finally, how is the product of what you find out about this hypothesis, how is it going to relate to your larger story? Hypotheses may be interesting, but may be irrelevant to the larger story, so focus on critical hypotheses that you need to solve. In terms of generating a work plan, be sure you budget time to design your research. I'll return to this later, but an old adage from construction is very helpful. Measure twice, cut once. Spend adequate time designing, because when you go out to collect data, it's easy to ask an additional well-designed question. It's almost impossible to go back and survey again or collect data a second time because you missed getting important data the first time. Allow extra time for primary data collection. Whether it's employees, customers, suppliers, or whomever, they'll get sick. They'll have to travel out on business. They'll have a meeting or an emergency come up. So let me just repeat that. Allow extra time for primary data collection. Allow yourself ample time for analysis. I've seen projects where people have collected great data, but then in the client presentation, they ran out of time and they can't tell the client what that data means. And finally, have your deliverables manager focused on the final deliverable at all time. What's the format? What's the font? What's the general tenor of our final deliverable? And are we thinking about how the data we're going to collect is going to flow into that deliverable? I don't want your team on the 10th of March or the 11th of March scrambling to reformat all of the data and everything that they've learned. So have your deliverables manager involved at every stage of the process. Now let's spend a few minutes on gathering data and analyzing it. In terms of gathering data, it's primary data that tends to add the most value. You have access to great secondary resources, IBIS World, Mintel reports, other reports that your client may not have access to, but the deep questions that they have almost always will be resolved by primary data. And they don't have the time and often the expertise to go get that primary data, but you do. Again, to repeat something from before, measure twice and cut once. Are you going to go for deep data? So interviewing 10 employees to get deep and rich responses, or are you going to put out a survey to 400 or 500 employees where you might get 1 to 5 responses for 3 to 5 questions? Both types of data have their advantages and have their role to play, but you need to be explicit about whether you want deep data or broad data. Generally, earlier in the project, you want deeper data. Later in the project, when you're confirming your hypotheses, you want broad data. Be aware that storing data is actually harder than you think. It's easy for files to get lost. It's easy for interviews to get misplaced. So your data manager needs to be active in making sure that you've got both capture, collection, and access to all the data that you'll need. And then finally, think about, is your data approach going to be sort of survey where we know the questions that we want to ask and we're expecting you to answer in some predefined ways, or are you trying to develop a grounded theory? Meaning that you'll go out and talk to 3 or 4 people and then you'll analyze and you'll look for patterns in what they said, and you'll use those patterns and those emerging theories to guide the next phase of data collection. Again, both have their advantages, and you just want to be clear about which one you're going to use and also when you might use it. In terms of data analysis, analysis is where the real value comes. It's not merely surveying those 400 employees or those 15 deep interviews. It's what does that mean? What does that imply for the problem that the firm is facing? Keep your method simple. Here I've got a very complex fixed effect hazard rate Poisson regression. It's a very, very sophisticated empirical tool. Keep it simple. Maybe look for correlations. Make tables to look for pattern matching. Again, you don't have the time to do the sophisticated modeling, and your client probably isn't going to understand what you tell them anyway. So keep your analysis simple, but don't get bogged down in the obvious. If, for example, you interview both men and women and you find out that women have different response rates than men or different preferences than men, that in and of itself may not be earth-shattering. That's sort of the obvious. So try not to get bogged down in that, and we're going to talk about looking for deeper insight. Now, as you look for insight, be careful about equating correlation with causation. So there's a great example from the 19th century. In 19th century America, there was a period of time when arrests and legal problems for alcohol abuse and misuse were on the rise and climbing dramatically. At the same time, there was a rise in the number of ministers preaching in churches around the country. And so, at first blush, researchers thought, well, it must be an uptick in alcohol use and abuse that's prompting more preachers and more ministers to come out and to speak against that. Well, a deeper understanding of American society revealed that American population was growing rapidly in the 19th century. And that alone would account for an increased number of arrests for alcohol abuse and misuse, as well as increased church attendance and the increase in the number of preachers. So as you think about your data and relationships, be careful to sift out correlation from causation. And finally, we talked about insight. Insight is money. That's what adds real value to your client. What's a good insight? A good insight is when you can find data or responses or patterns in the data that violate assumptions that your client might have had. Remember Lincoln Electric. They had the assumption that European customers would never buy at a trade show, would never buy imported materials. They'd have to buy it locally produced. That assumption turned out to be false, and they violated it when they collected some data. Secondly, good insight opens up new lines of inquiry. So perhaps you were surveying both men and women, and you found out that they wanted different things or had different opinions of the company. but some of the content of those opinions might suggest new ways for the organization to solve whatever problem it's having. So remember that insight is money. So I hope you find this logical process helpful and useful to you as you begin the capstone project and as you work on writing a case study. Please remember that the objective in writing a case study is to find out as much as you can about the company and the issue that it's facing. And that's the basis of a good case study, because you've got to accurately diagnose the problem before you can start to prescribe solutions and remedies. So thanks for taking time to watch this, and good luck.